Now, historically, the pioneers said that this happened in the year 508, which 1290 from 508 brings you to 1798. And 1335 from 508 brings you to 1843. You can see it right here at the bottom of the 1843 chart, how they calculated that time period. And so we need to see, how did they come up with the year 508? And by the way, inspiration tells us from Sister White that they correctly calculated this date. They were right. And we've looked at that in previous quotes, where she says that the pioneers had a correct understanding of the daily. And when she says that, she doesn't necessarily mean they had a fully correct understanding of the meaning. She says that she means that they had a correct understanding of calculating the prophetic period, starting in 508. So whether or not they had the right reason why it was 508, they did. 508 was the correct date, because they got all the prophetic dates right, even though they often misunderstood the meaning or only had a partial understanding of the meaning. So we need to understand what happened in 508. Here on the Ellen White estate, it tells us this is from the Pioneer Writings. It's from a writing of a man called Apollos Hale, who was a prominent pioneer. He wrote a book called the Second Advent Manual, where he documented what the early Advent believers preached. And this document in particular really kind of explains their understanding behind these prophetic charts, in particular behind the 1843 chart. And it tells us here, beginning on page 73, paragraph 2 of the Second Advent Manual, it says, the part taken by Clovis in behalf of the Catholic faith after his conversion is clearly brought to view by these extracts from this ancient historian, Mosheim. But we wish to present to our readers a more extended view of his history with the chronology of the important events of his life. We quote from Gifford's History of France. So they're quoting historians, and they're talking about King Clovis, who was the king of the Franks, which is modern-day France. Now, King Clovis, it tells us, was married in the year AD 1493. And he actually married a princess named Clotilda, who was a Catholic. Clovis himself was a pagan. He was a pagan king, like many of the leaders of all the 10 nations that rose up, the 10 toes of the statue, or the 10 horns on the beast, which represent the 10 nations that came out of the breakup of the Western Roman Empire, were all really headed by pagans. Clovis being one of them, the king of the Franks. And he married a Catholic princess. And though when they first got married, he wasn't converted. And in fact, she initially convinced him to baptize their infant son. And he agreed to it, and then that infant son died. And that actually initially made Clovis kind of wary of the Catholic faith. He's like, oh, you had me baptize this child in the name of your God, and then the child dies. But nevertheless, for whatever reason, 3 years later, he converted and became Catholic. Now, he didn't become a true Christian. He just became a nominal Christian, which in that time was a Catholic. He didn't have a change of heart, but he nominally changed his faith from being a pagan to being what we would call today a false Christian. And that happened in the year 496. And then it tells us that between that time, the year 496, and the year 508, by alliances, capitulations, and conquests, the Alberici, the Roman garrisons in the west, Brittany, the Burgundians, and the Visigoths were brought into subjection. So huge swaths of the Western Roman Empire were brought into subjection by Clovis and his armies. And that included the Roman garrisons throughout the Western Roman Empire, The Arborici, who are a powerful clan. Brittany is speaking about what we would call Britannia, or Britain today. The Burgundians are Switzerland, and the Visigoths are Spain. So this is the major part of Europe was brought into subjection to Clovis by the year 508. And it continues here. AD 508, it was on his return from this last expedition that he received at the city of Tours the ambassadors of Anastasius, the emperor of the East, who sent him the title and insignia of patrician and consul, and conferred on him the dignified appellation of August. The new patrician, after dismissing the ambassadors, returned to Paris, which he made the capital of his empire. Success had hitherto attended to all the plans of Clovis, and allowing for the ferocious and martial spirit which then prevailed, he had preserved his fame from any material pollution. But his good fortune and his heroism appeared to have forsaken him at the same time. It was probably to wipe out the infamy occurred in the commission of so many crimes that he founded a great number of churches and monasteries. So he started building churches and monasteries, Catholic churches and monasteries, to try to cover up all his wickedness, really, in his heart, and what things that he was doing. And it continues in talking that he died just 3 years later in AD 511. And it tells us, continues, paganism in the Western Roman Empire, though it doubtless retarded the progress of the Christian faith, especially in those nations which were molested, as in the case of England, by the inroads of the barbarous clans who continued idolaters, henceforth had not the power, if it had the disposition, to suppress the Catholic faith or to hinder the encroachments of the Roman pontiff. So what it's really telling us there, from that time, the papal abomination was triumphant, so far as paganism was concerned. Its future contests were with the other Christian sects, who were always treated as heretics, and with the princes, who were always treated as rebels or dividers of the body of Christ. The prominent powers of Europe gave up their attachment to paganism only to perpetuate its abominations in another form. For paganism only needed to be baptized to become Christian, in the Catholic sense. They became wedded to it as a matter of policy, and when the interest or vengeance of its presiding minister made the demand that possessions and thrones, perhaps their lives, must be laid on the altar. So we see here a beautiful summary that paganism, so going all the way back to Constantine, the emperors from that time were, quote, Catholic emperors. But that was when the empire was still just one empire. When the barbarian nations came and broke up the Western Roman Empire into the 10 nations, each of the heads of those 10 nations were pagan. So paganism still maintained the supremacy. But by the time of Clovis, he conquered a sufficient number of those pagan rulers that paganism no longer had any power. And Catholicism, or false Christianity, rose into the ascendancy. And the year that marked that happening was AD 508. Where there were no longer, and in particular, to understand that, it was the civil power. The Clovis and the kings of these different nations, where the civil power had now submitted to false Christianity. It wasn't until AD 538 that the papacy got religious power. It wasn't until the three horns were plucked up that the papacy got full religious power and the union of church and state was complete. But the civil power had already yielded to Rome, the Bishop of Rome, through Clovis by the year 508. That's the reasoning that they used to come to the date 508, which we're told was the correct date. Interestingly, for time's sake, I'm not going to spend a lot of time reading it, but in this same document, it tells us that in the same year, 508, the emperor who was ruling at that time got in a dispute with faction of the papal interests, because the Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople was always sort of disputing with the Western Roman Empire in Rome. and they had a dispute, and this dispute was continuing in the capital, in the eastern capital, in Constantinople, and there was basically a civil war in the capital. And in that civil war, it came to the point where the emperor reached out to the Bishop of Rome and asked for help to save his position, because he was about to lose that civil war. And he only ended up keeping his seat of power because he yielded to the Bishop of Rome. So here's another case where the civil power, the emperor, yielded to the supremacy of Rome, and the Bishop of Rome in particular. Again, false Christianity. So in both cases, whether it's what happened with Clovis or what had happened in the capital, the eastern capital, Constantinople, there was this yielding to false Christian power in the year 508. So if we were expecting an antitypical 508 event to happen, somehow the civil power of America would need to yield to the papal power in some way, or to false Christianity in some significant way. And I believe that that actually happened in the week between February 4th and February 8th, just as expected. So let's see if we can understand how that happened. Itself, a copy of the Pope's address to Congress. And we talked about how this joint address, this address of the Pope, the Holy Father, as they like to call themselves, to Congress was unprecedented. It never happened ever before in history. Not only had the Pope never done it before, but no religious leader has ever been allowed to address the joint session or joint meeting of Congress in history. I have a whole list of them here, actually, right from the House archives of the U.S. House, goes through a list of every single person who's ever been allowed to speak, every foreign leader who's ever been able to allowed to speak to Congress. And foreign leaders have been allowed to speak to Congress, but none of them were religious leaders. They were all only civil leaders of other nations. Pope Francis is the only religious leader who's ever been allowed to address a joint session or joint meeting of Congress. And by the way, Pope Francis is not only a religious leader, he's also a king. He's also a foreign leader of a nation, the Papal States. So his address here to Congress is very significant. And in that address, he tells them, right from the beginning, after his little normal formalities, he says, "I am most grateful for your invitation to address this joint session of Congress." It was actually technically a joint meeting of Congress, but in the land of the free and the home of the brave. I'd like to thank. The reason for this is that I too am a son of this great continent from which we have all received so much and toward which we share common responsibility, which is a little strange because he's from the southern American continent, not the northern one, but he seems to think they're all one continent. He says, each son or daughter of a given country has a mission, a personal and social responsibility. This is the Pope's address. Your own responsibility as members of Congress is to enable this country by your legislative activity to grow as a nation. You are the face of its people, their representatives. So he seems here to have taken, to be able to tell the Congress what their mission and responsibility is as a legislative body, which is pretty presumptuous, quite frankly. He's telling them what their responsibilities are. And he tells them specifically, you are called to defend and preserve the dignity of your fellow citizens in the tireless and demanding pursuit of the common good. And we're going to see this word common good is absolutely key to understanding what's going on here. Even though it just sounds like, if you didn't know, it would just sound like, well, that just sounds okay. Who wouldn't agree with that? But we're going to see the common good has a very particular meaning, which we're going to look at very closely together. He tells them their whole reason for existence as a Congress is to tirelessly and demandingly pursue the common good for this is the chief aim of all politics. A political society endures when it seeks as a vocation to satisfy common needs by stimulating the growth of all of its members, especially those in situations of great vulnerability or risk. Legislative activity is always based on care for the people. To this you have been invited, called, and convened by those who elected you. So they need to, as he told the Congress in his unprecedented speech before them, that they need to pursue the common good. And then it continues on. Interestingly, he calls out Moses and what he did, but for time's sake, I need to move that up a little. We're going to skip down a little bit, and this is not too far down. He then mentions 4 Americans that he wants to talk about: Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, Dorothy Day, and Thomas Merton. Dorothy Day and Thomas Merton are 2 prominent Catholics, by the way. And he tells us this year marks the 150th anniversary of the assassination of President Lincoln, which, by the way, the Jesuits were behind. The guardian of liberty, who labored tirelessly that this nation under God might have a new birth of freedom. Building a future of freedom requires love of the common good and cooperation in a spirit of subsidiarity and solidarity. So again, he's telling them here that in order to have a future of freedom, they need to not only pursue the common good, they need to love the common good, and they need to cooperate in order to achieve the common good. And then interestingly, he suddenly goes and he says, all of us are quite aware of and deeply worried by the disturbing social and political situation of the world today. Our world is increasingly a place of violent conflict, hatred, and brutal atrocities, committed even in the name of God and religion. We know that no religion is immune from forms of individual delusion or ideological extremism. Now, when he says that no religion is immune, would that include Christian religion? Obviously. Well, from the mindset of the papacy, the ones who have an individual delusion, those are the heretics who don't think the way the church wants them to think. And they have ideological extremism, again, because they're coming up with their own ideas of what the Bible says. He's condemning Bible believers here, right after talking about needing a love for the common good and cooperating towards it.
You talk about people coming up with their own ideas of what the Bible says. Aren't we talking a little bit about our own individual ideas of what the Bible says, or what the Bible has to say about itself?
We're talking about the Catholic mindset that if you think for yourself, you're a heretic. That's what heresy actually means. It means to choose for oneself what to believe. And he is defining that as being associated with being an extremist that actually ends up leading to violence and hatred. Stick with me for a minute here. He continues, this means that we must be especially attentive to every type of fundamentalism. If believing that the scriptures are the revelation of God and that we need to obey every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God is defined as being a Christian fundamentalist. So he says we need to be especially attentive of the fundamentalists, which would include Christian fundamentalists, which would be Bible-believing Christians, whether religious or of any other kind. A delicate balance is required to combat violence perpetrated in the name of religion, an ideology, or an economic system, while also safeguarding religious freedom and intellectual freedom and individual freedoms. Which he's just throwing that in there to sound reasonable. But there's also another temptation that we must especially guard against, the simplistic reductionism which sees only good or evil, or if you will, righteous and sinners. If you are a Bible-believing Christian, does the Bible teach clear lessons of right and wrong, black and white, good and evil, and righteous and sinners? But he says we need to guard against people who think like that, in the context of loving the common good. The contemporary world with its open wounds, interesting language, the contemporary world has open wounds. Any prophetic thoughts there, that there's an open wound that needs to be healed, which so affects so many of our brothers and sisters, demands that we confront every form of polarization which would divide into these two camps. Do we understand prophetically that the world is going to divide into two camps at the end of the time? He is telling the Congress that they need to do everything to prevent that from happening. We know that in an attempt to be freed from the enemy without, we can be tempted to feed the enemy within. To imitate the hatred and violence of tyrants and murderers is the best way to take their place. That is something which you, as a people, reject. Interestingly, even though he says we reject it, he's saying that the best way to deal with people that you don't like is to become like a tyrant and a murderer. Our response must instead be one of hope and healing, of peace and justice. We are asked to summon the courage and the intelligence to resolve today's many geopolitical and economic crises. Even in the developed world, the effects of unjust structures and actions are all too apparent. Our efforts must aim at restoring hope, righting wrongs, maintaining commitments, and thus promoting the well-being of individuals and peoples. We must move forward together as one in a renewed spirit of fraternity, solidarity, cooperating generously for the common good.
He doesn't say reciprocity.
No, he does not. So he wants
What he means, though.
He wants to get rid of anybody who is going to take a stand on the Bible, and we must do everything to stand against them, and we must cooperate for the common good in order to achieve that. If we
Interesting about that is, what I find interesting about that is he's preventing people from thinking for themselves freely, which is the very same thing that the fundamentalists are being accused of preventing people from doing.
That's correct, yes.
Thinking about the Bible, deciding for themselves what the Bible has to say instead of studying it and finding out what God has to say in his word.
Yeah. So he's speaking like a dragon with a forked tongue.
Double speak.
Yes, that's exactly, they're the masters of it. The papacy is the masters of that, and particularly the Jesuits, and he is a Jesuit, the first Jesuit pope.
Amen.
So he's talking about, then he starts talking, skip down a little bit, he starts talking about the political history of America, and he's sort of trying to say that it's all under God, and which is, sort of true, but he's again doing doublespeak as he talks about it. And he continues, in the middle of the paragraph, if politics must truly be at the service of human person, it follows that it cannot be a slave to the economy or finance. Politics is instead an expression of our compelling need to live as one, in order to build as one the greatest common good. That of a community which sacrifices particular interests in order to share in justice and peace its goods, its interests, and its social life. I do not underestimate the difficulty this involves, but I encourage you in this effort. So we have to sacrifice our own particular interests, like our own understanding of what the Bible teaches, in order to become one to achieve the greatest common good. And then further down in the passage, it also tells us that he gets into some financial and technological aspects of this. It goes into every aspect of life: education, finance, social relations, technology, the environment. He relates it to everything. And being inclusive and sustainable. And he continues, it can be a fruitful source of prosperity for the area in which it operates, especially if it sees in the creation of jobs an essential part of its service of the common good. And then he connects it to the environment and his encyclical that came out earlier that year in 2015, called Laudato Si, which, by the way, in that encyclical, he said one of the ways that we need to preserve the environment is by resting on Sunday. Because if all that decreased economic activity by not working on Sunday would be good for the environment. So now we can see he's making a connection between the common good and Sunday rest, which is part of how you oppose these fundamentalists who see things in black and white.
Well, I believe he thinks the common good is his good.
That's absolutely right, yes. And he says the common good includes the earth, a central theme of the encyclical, which I recently wrote. Okay, so that, I wish we could spend more time on it, but that's the basic message from the Pope when he came in 2015. All about the common good, about cooperating for the common good, about compromising and sacrificing to bring about that common good, and resisting the fanatics and the fundamentalists. And that is the job of the US Congress, according to what the Pope told the Congress. And he started out by talking as if he was the one telling them what they were supposed to do, and they should just listen to what he says. Now, as we consider that, we need to understand what is this common good. Okay. This is from the Catholic Social Teaching website, because the common good is not just it's not what you think it is. It sounds just like something that's good for everybody, that's common. But it's actually a particular, specific Catholic social teaching, which is defined right here in this glossary from the Catholic Social Teaching website. It says, the common good is the complete development of all people of the world. John 23, who is actually the Pope at the Second Vatican Council, describes it as the sum total of the conditions of social living whereby persons are enabled to more fully and readily achieve their own perfection. That's what the common good is, according to Catholic teaching. So when the Pope says the common good, he doesn't mean what's good for everybody in common, as people might generally understand that term. He means this Catholic social teaching, which is about every aspect of social life being put to the task of enabling people to achieve their own perfection. That's righteousness by works. It is a Catholic social teaching that undergirds their entire religious philosophy of righteousness by works. That you can achieve your own perfection by the things that you do and how you interrelate with other people. He continues, the idea therefore differs from that of pursuing the greatest good for the greatest number, which is what it is sometimes confused with. Because of the pursuit of the common goods and trusts, both to the government and the church, to care for the greatest good of all persons, not just the greatest possible number. So the common good not only is this fundamental social teaching about righteousness by works, but it's not what you generally think it is, he says, the general meaning of that word that you might think, but it instead means a combination of the government and the church seeking to the care of every single person and not just most people, which means no one can go against this teaching because it has to involve everybody. And anybody who's against this teaching needs to be gotten rid of because everybody needs to come together on this Catholic social teaching of the common good. So it continues, no individual is excluded from the common good. So we've seen the common good is a Catholic teaching and no individual is allowed to be excluded. according to the official glossary of what the common good is, according to Catholics. So no one, this is the basis for the coming persecution, that no one is going to allow to opt out. Everybody has to be included. It is also therefore linked to the ideas of human dignity and authentic and integral human development, making them central aims of all societies. And then it goes on to talk about how it has this idea of interdependency. That's why no one can be left out. In fact, it even makes this really interesting analogy. It says, where if anyone is a number 0, that means you're trying to opt out. Then that makes the whole total by multiplication be 0. And so you're ruining it for everybody else if you try to opt out. If anyone is left out or deprived, then the common good has been betrayed. In fact, that's what it finishes on by saying that there has to be a balance between not letting people have too much individualism, deciding for themselves, but instead emphasizing the social aspect where we all compromise for what's for the greater good for everybody, which is the Catholic social teaching. So that's what actually the common good actually is, according to their own sources. This is officially an official Catholic website on Catholic social teaching, and their own official definition in their glossary of what the common good is. Now, just to make it clear, this is from the Vatican itself on this page. This is the Catechism of the Catholic Church, and it's on the 10 Commandments, and what they call the third commandment being the so-called Sabbath commandment, which they take to mean Sunday. And at the bottom of this page, it tells us that here, in a footnote to this understanding, it tells us, in respecting religious liberty and the common good of all, so when you apply the common good in the context of the commandments of God, Christians should seek recognition of Sundays and the church's holy days as legal holidays. So it's official Catholic teaching that in order to promote the common good and to cooperate with the common good, the government and the church should come together and recognize Sundays as legal holidays. This the justification right there for a Sunday law is inherent in the idea of pursuing the common good as the Pope presented it to the U.S. Congress. Now, with that understanding, let's look at the State of the Union address, which happened on February 5th, 2019, which was exactly on the day that would be the 30 days prior to the 1260, if the date started when the Pope spoke to Congress. Or it would be the antitypical 508 date, was the exact day when the State of the Union address was given by President Trump, when he addressed the exact same body that the Pope had addressed 1,230 days prior. And at that address, President Trump's State of the Union address, and here is President Trump giving his address to the Congress. By the way, in this body where both the Pope spoke and where now President Trump is speaking here in the picture, behind him, behind the Pope when he spoke, were two Catholics. The Vice President, Biden, when the Pope spoke, and the Speaker of the House, Ryan, when the Pope spoke, were both Catholics. Now, when President Trump comes and he speaks, exactly 1,230 days later, there's two Catholics behind him. Vice President Pence, who was raised Catholic and now calls himself a born-again evangelical Catholic, and Nancy Pelosi, who is also a Catholic. Podium from which they're speaking, but an evangelical Catholic is one who's marrying the Catholics and the Protestants, which is exactly what prophecy tells us is going to happen. And behind them on the podium, by the way, is, if you see here, I can even blow it up for us for a second. On either side of the flag here on the wall are a bundle of rods with an axe head. Do you know what that's called? It's called a fasciae, which is where we get the word fascism from. And it's actually the symbol of a Roman consul, a Roman leader who was the person, the civil leader of the Romans in any territory was called the Roman consul. And he held a fasciae, a bundle of rods with an axe head, as a symbol of his power. So this is a symbol of Roman power. And fascism is the symbol that sits on the wall in our Congress. Did you know that?
Is that there all the time or just during the speech?
No, it's always there, because
Wow.
that's actually who we are. We're Rome.
Oh,
The
yeah.
power of Rome is actually what's ruling. So here's President Trump's address. The antitypical 508 date. President Trump gives an address to the exact same Congress that the Pope just gave his speech to 3.5 years ago, talking about the common good and cooperating for the common good, which is really righteousness by works and a Sunday law, and the government and the church combining to achieve it and to fight against the radicals who believe the Bible. And here, President Trump delivers his State of the Union address. He begins with his pleasantries. Madam Speaker, Vice President, members of Congress, First Lady of the United States, my fellow Americans, we meet tonight at a moment of unlimited potential. Suddenly, there's unlimited potential. As we begin a new Congress, I stand here ready to work with you to achieve historic breakthroughs for all Americans. So there's something historic happening, and it's a breakthrough from prior policy. Millions of our fellow citizens are watching us now, gathered in this great chamber, hoping that we will govern not as two parties, but as one nation, that will all to come together as one. By the way, we saw earlier how Pope Francis said that we all had to become one to achieve the greater good. He continues, the agenda I will lay out this evening is not a Republican agenda or a Democrat agenda. It's the agenda of the American people. It's the agenda of America. We'll skip down a little bit for time's sake, but he continues, by the way, later on here, he talks about two things that happened in history, two milestones that were happening this year in America. He says, this year, America will recognize two important anniversaries that show us the majesty of America's mission and the power of American pride. Now, is pride a good thing? Didn't we see that pride was actually a part of this principle of self-exaltation and proud boasting and rebellion against the law of God? Now America needs to have the same pride, and it represents its majesty, its dominion. In June, we marked 75 years since the start of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, called the Great Crusade. Who was actually behind the Crusades anciently? That would be the papal power. And actually, Dwight Eisenhower did call it the Great Crusade. Interesting enough, it was a modern crusade, actually, to wipe out Protestants and Bible-believing Jews. And don't really realize that. And so he's pointing to a modern-day crusade, and it's an anniversary. And then he also talks about how it was a 50-year anniversary since they planted the flag on the face of the moon. Now, without getting into the whole idea of whether or not that really happened, let's just accept that that's what he was saying it was the 50-year anniversary of. Says that we now need to step boldly and bravely into the next chapter of this great American adventure. Now, prophetically, what's the next chapter in the great American adventure? It's the final events where the image of the beast is set up. That's prophetically what's the next chapter in America's adventure. And then he explains that to us very clearly in the next chapter, in the next paragraph. This is the key paragraph. He says, an amazing quality of life for all of our citizens is within our reach. We saw earlier that the idea of the common good had to be for all, not just for some. We can make our community safer, our families stronger, our culture richer, our faith deeper, government promoting religion, and our middle class bigger and more prosperous than ever before. But we must reject the politics of revenge, resistance, and retribution and embrace the boundless potential of cooperation and compromise for the common good. Did President Trump just adopt the policy that Pope Francis said we needed to do? The Catholic social teaching of righteousness by faith, as symbolized by
Absolutely.
setting up Sunday laws? And he said we had to cooperate to do it. Over and over again, Pope Francis said we had to cooperate to achieve the common good. Now President Trump is saying we need to cooperate to achieve the common good. He also says we need to compromise to do it. We need to compromise our individual beliefs, say in the Bible, so that we can all now achieve the common good together.
But do you think that President Trump knows that there is a special Catholic definition to common good? And do you think he's promoting that, or do you think he's just using the common good like someone who doesn't know about the Catholic and just sounds good for all his constituents?
His political writer is a Jesuit.
I think for sure his political writer knew exactly what he was doing and was a Jesuit, yes. Now,
And Walter V. speaking
people
of that,
people could argue whether he knows. I personally think he does know. I think that he is being taught by demons how to do what he does.
But he's not Catholic, right?
No, but we're going to see. He's basically been he was most of his life he was what we would call a pagan, just like Clovis was a pagan. He sometime along the way had a nominal conversion to false Christianity, especially when he began his political career, when he wanted to have the evangelical vote. He started talking like he believed in what they believed in.
Mm-hmm.
So he had a, quote, nominal conversion, just like Clovis had a nominal conversion. And now he's officially pushing the government policy towards the Catholic teaching. And I'm sure that, again, the speechwriter knew for sure.
Yeah,
And
I believe that.
I believe Trump actually knows too, because I think he's having demonic help. I think that's how he got into his position.
Perhaps.
I think he's wiser than he thinks. He's certainly a Freemason and communing with demons. So he says, it continues, together we can break decades of political stalemate. We can bridge old divisions. Now, the papacy, one of the titles of the papacy is called Pontifex Maximus. That's one of his main titles. Pontifex Maximus means bridge builder. He wants to bridge old divisions. Are there old divisions between Catholicism and Protestants, say, that need to be bridged? We can what? Heal old wounds. Is there anything prophetically sound familiar with healing old wounds?
the deadly wound was healed.
The deadly wound was healed. He's calling for the deadly wound to be fully healed in the speech. We saw that Pope Francis mentioned the wound too in his speech. Now there's a call from the leadership of our country to submit to this Catholic teaching, to cooperate and compromise towards it in order to heal the wound.
And I believe it was in Minneapolis where the great Kenneth Copeland was anointed by all the rest of the pastors to give the keynote speech, at which he said, "We've been protesting for some 500 years. It's time to be over."
Yes, the protest is over. Yes, that's right. So we need to bridge old divisions, heal old wounds. I mean, that didn't just slip in there. Build new coalitions forge new solutions, and unlock the extraordinary promise of America's future. Prophetically, what is the promise of America's future? It's the image of the beast. That's what he wants to unlock by building new coalitions and forging new solutions that bridge old divisions and heal old wounds. And he tells us the decision is ours to make. We must choose between greatness or gridlock, results or resistance, vision or vengeance, incredible progress or pointless destruction. Doesn't seem like there's any middle ground there. Tonight, I ask you to choose greatness. We saw in Daniel chapter 8, what was the word that told us the principle of self-exaltation and proud boasting in rebellion against the law of God? It was the word great. Trump has a whole slogan, political slogan, to make America great again. And now he's telling the whole nation to choose this greatness, to bring this whole principle of self-exaltation in rebellion against the law of God and bring it right into the church and combine the church and the state to achieve the common good. And we need to enact Sunday laws if we're going to do that. We already saw that from the Catholic teaching. Over the last 2 years, my administration has moved with urgency and historic speed to confront problems neglected by leaders of both parties over many decades. So he's calling for it, and then he goes through a whole bunch of platitudes and other, generally, often things that might sound good to us. He concludes his very last paragraph of his speech. I ask the men and women of this Congress, the representatives, the ones who can speak like a dragon. We're told that the speaking of the dragon in Revelation 13 is the action of the legislative and judicial bodies. I ask the men and women of this Congress, look at the opportunities before us. Our most thrilling achievements are still ahead. Our most exciting journeys still await. Our biggest victories are still to come. We have not yet begun to dream. We must choose whether we are defined by our differences or whether we dare to transcend them. We must choose whether we squander our inheritance or whether we proudly declare we are Americans. We do the incredible, proud boasting and rebellion against the law of God. We defy the impossible. We conquer the unknown. Very interesting words, defiance and conquering, which is related to dominion. This is the time to reignite the American imagination. This is the time to search for the tallest summit, to set our sights on the brightest star. What is the brightest star in the sky? Sirius, the dog star, which is in the occult the symbol of Satan. And he says, he's telling the men and women of Congress, the ones who can speak like a dragon, that they need to set their sights on the dog star, Satan. We need to look to the Luciferian future. This is the time to rekindle the bonds of love and loyalty and memory that link us together as citizens, as neighbors, as patriots. By the way, again, we saw in that common good Catholic social teaching about how everybody needs to be interdependent. This is our future, our fate, and our choice to make. I am asking you again to choose greatness. No matter the trials we face, no matter the challenges that come, we must go forward together for the common good. We must keep America first in our hearts. We must keep freedom alive in our souls. We must always keep faith in America's destiny. We must keep faith in America. We must keep the religion in the destiny of America's government. That one nation under God must be the hope and the promise and the light and the glory among all the nations of the world. You see how the nation is the hope, the promise, the light, and the glory? Not God is not the hope, the promise, the light, and the glory. But the nation is. That's proud boasting in rebellion against the law of God. And he says, thank you, God bless America, and good night. So the very charge that Pope Francis gave at the beginning of the antitypical 7 times, and we're looking for an antitypical 508 event to happen exactly 1,230 days later. On that very day, it worked out that the State of the Union address before the exact same body happened, and it had to be a whole government shutdown to make that happen. The very things that Pope Francis said, now Trump is saying that's what we need to do. And his principle, his pagan mindset of proud boasting, and if there was ever a person who was like a poster child for proud boasting, is Donald Trump and self-exaltation. And that's what he's all about. He's built a whole career on self-exaltation and proud boasting. And now he's taking that principle and he's turning it into the church doctrine and seeking to create a union of church and state in his speech. On the very day when antitypically we're supposed to see the pagan power and the dominion of the pagan power and that principle of proud boasting being turned aside to false Christianity now having the ascendancy. It's the very thing that was supposed to happen. Because anciently it happened literally. I mean, Clovis conquered literal nations to bring it to pass. But it's just happening spiritually here. But that's what we'd expect to happen.